Good evening, everybody. If I should stray from the microphone or I'm speaking too fast, just wave your arm, please. There's nothing worse than not understanding what people say. Is this okay?
Yes.
It's a real honour to be here speaking in Bangalore, and I would like to thank Bangalore International Centre and Pratiti Balan especially for arranging it. It's a little bit daunting to have all these real textile experts here, but I'm talking not so much about techniques as about cultures. So this is not a talk about passing fashion, or on the other hand, the exploitative practices of the East India companies, several of them. What I'd like to share with you is the ways in which textiles from the Indian subcontinent have permeated British material culture and its vocabulary of design for nearly 500 years. In some ways, this was a managed policy, as we'll hope we'll see. In others, part of a broader global movement of goods and styles. Clearly, this is still relevant today, even if the pace has changed. So I will focus on three types of textile from India: cotton chintz or kalamkari, muslin and Kashmir shawls. I mean, of course, there's the whole area of silk, but I don't have a huge knowledge about that trade, so I will not dwell on that. Right, we'll come back to the Beatles in a minute. Right, where's the problem? It's important to say, first of all, that of course India had a huge textile trade long before the Europeans arrived and set up their trading companies. So here are two examples from that earlier trade. A printed and resist-dyed cotton textile made in Gujarat in the second half of the 13th century, the Common Era, the first half 14th century, which was found in Egypt. There was a great hoard of these fragments found in Egypt, near modern-day Cairo, possibly near modern-day Cairo. They were actually bought, I think, in the bazaars of Cairo. So several museums in the world have these. And below is a block printed and dyed cotton from Gujarat in India, which you will recognise the style, still current today, which was traded from India to South Asia. So these are just indicators of that long-established world trade that India already had. Sorry, back one. I'll get the hang of this in a minute. So you won't be able to read on this map, but all the points on the map show the different European colonizers and traders and when they landed in India, where they landed and their dates. So it shows their settlements. So it shows the Portuguese, the English, the French, the Dutch and the Danish. So although the British ended up on top through military power, they were by no means the only people trading and the only people who imported Indian textiles to their countries. So we won't go around it, but the first settlement was in Calicut, 1498. So Bengal is much later, in the mid-16th century at Hooghly. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of Britain, who you see standing on the map of the world as if she owned it, which was the plan, agreed that the East India Company could have a monopoly on trade with Asia and then other East India companies, other parts of the world. And the coat of arms at the top with this regal kind of throne that belonged that was sat on by the director of the company show the kind of grandiose ambitions and sentiments that they had about themselves. So the ships sailed from India back to London and unloaded in the London docks, which I'll come back to, and this is just to show the growth of the East India Company buildings, which reflected the growth of the company's activities and ambition. So I won't throw all the dates, but from the 17th to the 19th century, they started from this small merchant's house then a larger one, and then a great big sort of neoclassical building that no longer exists. It has Lloyd's of London, a very modern building at the time, replacing it. By 1664, the East India Company was importing 250,000 pieces of Indian textiles into Britain. Now the question is, what happened to them? We don't have millions of pieces from the 17th century. We only have a very few remaining from that date. So I set out to look at this at one point, and I found that in the inventories or list of contents of some of the great historic houses in England, there were references to Indian textiles. And I'll only show you 2 or 3 just to indicate the kind of places that had them, what they bought and how they were used. So this is an absolutely wonderful house called Hardwick Hall up in the north of England in Derbyshire, built by a very powerful woman, very good at developing properties at the time, called Bess of Hardwick. And in the inventory for this great house, there are a number of textiles, including 2 definitely from India, one an embroidered coverlet, very similar to the one on the left, and as there's no good photograph of it, I had to bring this one. So these were imported by the Portuguese. It was a very Portuguese taste from Bengal in the 17th century. And then there was an embroidered so-called floor spread from Gujarat from the early 18th century, shown on the right, and I'm sorry they're not very good pictures, the best I could get. Another house, a bit later, 18th century, is Osterley Park, just on the edge of London, which was built for the Child family, who tended to be directors of the British East India Company. So they had a very vested interest in the trade and had things that came from India in their possession, some of which survive, including this wonderful Gujarat embroidered bed canopy, still intact and somehow has survived all this time. So you can actually go around the house and see this, rather exciting. There's also, so I could go on with lots of other houses, but there isn't really time. There's evidence portraits, from painted portraits, which is interesting. And this is one of the earliest examples of a British person being painted in Indian dress. So he was a bit of an adventurer and spent part of his career in India working for the British East India Company. And here he is, painted, represented, his choice, in this sort of Indian suit. I mean, it's definitely not an English suit. And it's probably something he brought back from India. And whether he brought the Indian servant boy with him, I've no idea. But painted against a sort of oriental background with palm trees. And this is saying, I've been in India, and this is who I was in India. So a colleague at the V&A who's interested in men's dress got very excited about this and thought, oh, perhaps it's the origins of the man's suit in the West. So we don't know the answer. Another painting by the artist Josephine, who came to India and painted a number of portraits, both of Indians and Europeans. Wonderful portraits, actually. And this portrait is of a man called Elijah and Lady Impey and their family. Impey was the Chief Justice at the courts in Kolkata, and it was the capital of India at the time. He didn't last very long because he rather overreached himself and was gave out rather brutal punishments, I think, so he was sent back to England. But what's interesting is the way in which his child, his little boy, is represented wearing Indian dress. His baby is being held by the ayah, and although he and his wife are not wearing Indian dress, it's very much. This painting would have hung in his house in England. He would have brought it back with him, and it has an interesting story because it ended up in the house previously owned by Lord Clive, and it was then bought by this very rich Swiss manufacturer, Count Thyssen. It's now in the museum in Madrid that he's set up. So it ended up in this place called Dalesford, where Clive had lived. Strange kind of bit of post-colonial irony. There's also evidence from writers, Also, this one includes a painting. This is the famous diary writer Samuel Pepys, who lived through the Great Plague and the Fire of London, and is the most wonderfully vivid writer, wrote every day in code. And what is interesting here is that, first of all, he had his portrait painted, and it was a really big thing having this portrait painted. He commissioned the artist and one of his wife, though that painting doesn't survive, and he hired an Indian gown to wear for this painting. So this is a gown made of presumably Indian silk. So that was obviously the most hyper-fashionable thing that you could wear in 1666. Other entries say he went to the city to buy an Indian gown for myself. Another time he goes to buy a very noble party-coloured Indian gown for my wife. Another time he notes that his wife has this day put on her Indian blue gown, which is very pretty. So obviously Indian gowns were the thing. So I imagine not a sari or something, but a British style made out of Indian fabric. Now there's one wonderful example we have in Britain of a painting that links to an actual garment. And if anybody saw the Fabric of India exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, they would have seen this. And this is Captain John Foote of the East India Company, came back and had his painting, his portrait done by the most fashionable artist of the day, Joshua Reynolds, wearing an Indian gown and a turban. And we have this Indian gown survives, the very one he was painted in, which is really remarkable. I think it's the only example. And it's in a museum in York. So it's a muslin gown, printed or embroidered, I can't remember, embroidered with gold zari thread. And the shawl that he's wearing has a sort of patka around his waist has also survived. So this is a really interesting way of tying this up. And here is a similar technique on a muslin jama from just a little bit later in date, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So these three things tie up very nicely. Now the first Indian fabric to be a big hit in the West was chintz or kalamkari. So of course what was imported was completely different from kalamkari temple hangings, which were original purpose, the way they were used in India. But we don't know how the first one got to England, but they were gradually, the East India Company found that this was very popular and sent instructions back to England and pattern books, for example, flower books of the time, to suggest different designs that would appeal to Western customers. So there's absolutely amazing work. As you know, it's resist-dyed, painted, and is a multi-technique process. And we have some very, very fine examples in the Victoria and Albert Museum, as you do in museums here. So interestingly, it turns out that the British taste was for chintz with a white background. The Dutch East India Company also had a huge import trade, and the Dutch people actually preferred red backgrounds. So why this cultural difference should be, I don't know, but they had a lot of red and blue background chintzes. So this is Masulipattnam, or now Machilipatnam, also known as Bandar, at the end of the 17th century, from which all these chintzes were shipped out to Europe. I'm sure it looks very different today. I've not actually been there. But I'm sure you know that you have somebody in Bangalore who is Renuka Reddy, who is by herself rediscovered how to do this technique. I don't know if she's here, but she's doing absolutely amazing things, because she said there was nobody left who really knew how to do it in the traditional way. So another house with an Indian textile collection, which the house has been mainly demolished, but fortunately the textiles within it, the Indian textiles, ended up in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they were in extraordinarily good condition. So some of them are embroideries from Gujarat, wall hangings and so on. You can see some detail here. They're absolutely beautiful. So these date from 1680 to 1700. And they also have some extraordinary kalamkari, some chintz, which is one of the few examples to actually retain all its colours, because perhaps they were never used and were just put away, but it's very unusual to keep the green. So it's one of the few examples where the green hasn't faded down to blue, because very often the yellow dyes disappeared easily. They were sort of, I can't remember the word for it, anyway, they faded very easily, so it's unusual to get that. And here on the right so these were probably intended for hangings, for bed hangings and so on. Chintz tended to be used in bedrooms, not the grand rooms of the house. On the right is a recent example, 2018, of a very upmarket wallpaper and textile company called Sewn in Britain, who has used this as a very close inspiration for their furnishing. They do it in fabric and a wallpaper. And they say they're inspired by the exquisite antique embroidered panels from Ashburn and Place, well, the embroideries and the chintzes, actually. So a lot of manufacturers still go to the museum and use those Indian designs, because anybody's free to go and have a look. Here's an interesting example of sort of a chintz customised for Britain, or probably Scotland, because it has the coat of arms of the Royal Stuart family from Scotland worked into the centre. So this design would have been sent out from England and copied in this technique in Malichulipatnam. And on the right is a patchwork quilt. So these are made, as you probably know, from old pieces of cloth left over and recycled, a bit like kanta, but usually in a pattern. And they're all pieces of chintz, of Indian chintz. So it shows that by the early 18th century, these fabrics had already been well used and worn out, possibly in clothing. And so rather than throw them away, they're using them, reusing them in this quilt for somebody's bed. That's right. And here is a very nice example of chintz, Indian chintz, being used in a doll's house, which was made for this house called Nostell Priory in Yorkshire. Well, actually, I've never been there. And apparently it took so long to build the house that the owners, wealthy young couple, had a doll's house made whilst they were waiting. Similar to the house they planned for. And in the little bed, in the bedroom upstairs, perhaps the children's bedroom, they obviously recycled some bits of chintz, either from previous hangings or from clothing, to make the bed hangings and the curtains. So it's nice that it's survived. This is another famous example of chintz being highly fashionable. Here's a painting of the actor, who's a very, very famous actor. He was the most famous actor of his day, called David Garrick, and his wife was an actor as well. And this is the famous Garrick bed, which is in the V&A Museum. These are reproduction hangings at the moment, because the original ones are very fragile. Somebody sent to Mrs. Garrick these large pieces of chintz for her bed. And at the time, the British government was getting very angry about all the imported fabrics from India and what it was doing to the home trade, the woolen industries and so on. And so they held them up in customs and said they had to pay an enormous fee to be allowed to have them. And at that point, David Garrick put on his best performance ever, of wringing his hands and pulling his hair out and saying, "But my wife would be absolutely heartbroken if she can't have these textiles. You've got to let her have them." And they gave in, let him have them. It was the performance of his life, obviously. So chintz wasn't just used for hanging, for furnishings. It was extremely popular for dress, and I could give you many, many examples. This is a very beautiful jacket, again from the fabric from the Coromandel Coast would have been made up in England, and the reason it was so popular, apart from its beauty and the bright colours, is that you could wash it, and it would keep its colours because Indian dyers and textile painters had mastered the art of making washable coloured fabrics, and that just wasn't known in Britain, and people were otherwise wearing wool and linen, and the wool was obviously rather difficult to wash. So this was a huge success, and people would go down to the south coast of England to buy pirate, secret, smuggled-in chintzes from that had come from India, because there were these taxes set by the government eventually. And women who walked in parts of London where there were weavers, silk weavers, some of them had their dresses torn off their backs by the wives of the weavers, because they thought, they're going to do away with our husband's industry, that they won't have any work, because people will be wearing cotton and not silk. So that was in an area of London called Spitalfields, which is still quite atmospheric today, just about. And also, this is a picture which shows people in the very northern part of Holland, or the Netherlands, also where chintz was a sort of folk costume. Chintz from India was a folk costume until the 20th century. So you can even see it in a photograph, which is really quite extraordinary, because we can't obviously see photographs of people in the 17th and 18th centuries. So the museums in Holland also have very good collections of chintzes. Chintz was also very popular in France, and again the French were very protective of their textile industry, so they stopped them coming in through the regular Indian textiles coming in through regular ports. They could only come in through the south of France, through Marseille, which was a free port. And then there's sort of huge imitation industry set up, of printed textiles, but they were also, you can't see it very well because the picture's too small, but they were also hand painting in an attempt to do what was being done in India, not quite. So they developed their own style of doing what they called Indienne, which is Indian textiles. And there's some wonderful collections in France. And it's turned to what is now called the Provençal print. But this Provençal print being made today had its origin in India. So that's just to show it wasn't just the British. And final thing on chintz, there's a man called Baker, who was a textile manufacturer, cotton printed textiles, and he collected a huge number of beautiful kalamkari, wonderful tree of life hangings and so on, and gave 65 of them to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where you can see them today. And this is his textile printing work some years ago, where you can see they're actually doing hand block printing. I don't know whether they still are, this is an old picture. And a recent printed linen based on these kalamkari chintzes made in the 17th century. I can't help thinking that there's a link with the sort of Mughal tent, and well, in this case Tipu Sultan's tent, which was erected for the first time in Britain at the Fabric of India exhibition. So the idea of your whole room being covered in this floral fabric is sort of very much used in the English country house style. And here you see another fabric manufacturer, Josephine, saying their Jaipur collection. I mean, actually, Chintz has got nothing to do with Jaipur, but you know, it sounds Indian. They play on and update a strong tradition of using Indian and Persian designs in the decoration of English country house interiors, inspired by Indian Mughal paintings, or prints are manufactured in the UK. So here we are, great jumble of styles again. And then I found this, like it or not, Chintz is making a comeback in the world of design. So here we've got the Mughal tent, or the Tipu Sultan's tent, effectively, really. So you can see how this idea of these printed fabrics, as used as hangings, as tents and so on, works its way into the English home. And eventually everybody had a floral sofa cover, which had its origins in this Indian printed fabric. And when IKEA came to Britain, their first slogan was, "Throw out your old tired chintz," and now they brought it back again. So, you know. Right, now talk a little bit about muslin, which I'm particularly fond of. So, as you know, this is a museum label. Actually, it's an exhibition label. Sorry. it's not working, but anyway, the exhibition label in the middle indicates that it was bought for one of the international exhibitions and shown there as a piece of example of fine Indian workmanship. I'll come back to that. Sorry, back one. So what happens in the transition this time isn't that temple hangings turn into curtains, it's that a fabric that was made for men and women becomes the go-to fabric for women's dress at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. This particular jama, which is really amazing piece, has 277 panels in the skirt, and if you laid it out on the ground, the circumference, the hem would be 65 metres. It is, it is really a luxury garment because the fabric was not cheap. As you know, muslin is very laborious to make, and so this was the fashionable style for muslin. It came in at a time when people were trying to simplify dress, the complete opposite of complex 18th century dress, silk, layers of silk over huge constructions that held your whole dress up. You could hardly get through the door if you were at court. And it goes back, it's the idea of reviving classical ideals of Roman and Greek culture. So this is a very popular style because it's obviously very easy and comfortable to wear. So from a little village in Bengal, the fabrics were made on looms that are very, very similar today. I mean, they're really essentially exactly the same. I mean, the houses are now made of corrugated tin, so they're like little ovens, but at least they withstand the rains. And, the roads are a bit better, but it's really not terribly different. The technique is very, very simple. So these muslins, I'm not giving a talk on muslins, so I have to go through this a bit. Were brought down the river by boat. So this was the waterways in Bengal, undivided Bengal, so coming down the Hooghly and down particularly from Dhaka, which is a completely sort of waterlogged area. We've got crucial transport methods to bring them to Kolkata. And eventually they made their way to England, where they were sold at auction in the East India Company auction rooms in London. So they would show this dates from 1789, and I tried to find a dress of Indian muslin that was roughly of the same date to show what these fabrics turned into. So this particular sale, 1789, which you may note is the date of the French Revolution, which we'll come to, it says the sample pieces are taken from the bales. So they would take out sample pieces for the buyers, and that would have a number that would relate to the bale. So I counted in this particular sale that there were some 10,000 pieces of muslin from Bengal had come to London. And obviously it's such a fine, light fabric that it's great for shipping because you can pack an awful lot into one boat. So if you multiply that times the number of ships that were sailing in all the time, it's an extraordinary number. And I think it's very difficult to estimate because there's so many different names for cotton, calico, muslin, many varieties of cotton, of muslin, and the descriptions aren't always accurate, so it's really hard to give a proper an estimate. But I wouldn't mind betting it was in the millions. So one of the favoured, this is an embroidered muslin from then Bengal. The Dhaka would have been the Dhaka area. So every spot is embroidered, and spotted muslin was very much favoured in the West. And there's a lovely letters of Jane Austen, who mentions the novelist, who mentions muslin in her book. It always has a strong symbolic meaning in many novels. Thackeray, even Tolstoy mentions muslin is, it's kind of either the kind of fabric of doom or the fabric of youth. It always has some meaning attached to it. But Jane Austen also wrote wonderful letters to her sister, and a lot of them about shopping. And she goes off to buy muslin one day in 1811. She goes to buy some checked muslin, And then she says to her sister Cassandra, I found this lovely spotted muslin with a red spot that I thought you might like, so I bought you some. So it's probably very similar to this piece here. You can see the beautiful fine quality of the muslin underneath. It has that lovely loose weave. So, of course, fashions aren't just set by merchants. There are fashion leaders, like we have celebrities today photographed in clothes that designers put them in to wear at public events, so you think you'll want one because you want to look like them. So fashion leaders were obviously often royalty and, you know, the upper classes. So this portrait is interesting. It's Marie Antoinette, painted 6 years before the Revolution. She was painted by a woman artist called Elizabeth Vigée-Lepin, who liked to have her sitters wearing muslin, and she used to hold parties in which everyone had to get dressed up in muslin. And so the Queen wore this dress, which is the complete opposite of the kind of dresses she'd wear at court, which were very highly structured, complex silk constructions. But she had a little farm, as you may know, at Versailles, where she liked to pretend that she was a shepherdess and look after her animals. And this is the sort of thing she would wear on her farm, a little straw hat. But the portrait actually caused a huge scandal because they said the Queen shouldn't be painted in her underwear. Basically, she was undressed for a queen. So she couldn't get it right. Either she was too grand or she was trying to be too humble. But we do know that she sent a very similar dress to her friend, the Duchess of Devonshire, who had rather a scandalous life in many ways. And so here she is painted by the key portrait artist of the day, Thomas Gainsborough. And I don't know whether she's wearing a muslin dress, but they're remarkably similar, these two portraits. And she was such a fashion, people would have followed it. She wore one, other people would wear one. And so they are very, very similar, the angle of the hat, the style of the dress. So even if it isn't muslin, it could be, I feel. And it's 2 years after this one was painted, and there is a record of this dress being sent. The other French woman who also was completely in love with muslin was Josephine, wife of Napoleon Bonaparte. And she was the leader of this neoclassical, simple style of dress. Rather notoriously before her marriage, she's almost seen as almost naked in the way she wore them. But anyway, in her portrait, she was shown wearing this classical style of dress, and very often with a Cashmere shawl. In the V&A, I found that we had a wardrobe account of her, a detailed account of her wardrobe for the year 1809. And I counted this, and she had 97 muslin dresses in that 1 year, plus other chemises and blouses and everything, and also the laundry bills for cleaning them and repairing them. So if you go to the Château de Malmaison near Paris, you can see some of these garments. So this is actually one of her dresses. Now again, her husband, Napoleon, didn't like her to wear muslin because he wanted to support French silk industries. So it's reported that he tore them off her back and her daughters, the muslin dresses. But I don't know whether that's strictly true. So muslin had a very, very long life. It was obviously a beautiful fabric to wear, even if it was completely unsuitable for the British climate. In fact, it was known as the pneumonia fabric. And that's why Cashmere shawls were so popular, because it stopped you freezing to death. But the thing is that they adapted with changes in fashion style. They kept this on the right, so the fashion changes here, and then you get more of this sort of structured style later in the 19th century. This particular dress is completely embroidered with beetle wings, which would have been imported from India. As you know, this tradition of beetle wing embroidery came in, was very popular, and there's lots of amazing dresses in museums with beetle wings. Right, now I'll move on to the Cashmere Shawl. So here's a painting of a young woman in India with her native servants and her Cashmere shawl. So this was a print made in England, and whether this was originally painted in India, I don't know, but it's the kind of thing would be circulated in England. So people would be familiar with these images, like they were of the portraits. If you went into the Grand House, the portrait of the man and his children in Indian dress, you would register. It becomes part of your kind of visual culture. So the East India Company did not really trade in Kashmir shawls. It was rather out of their zone, Kashmir. So really it was more individual traders that brought, and people come returning from India who originally bought shawls back and sold them. And they became so highly fashionable and sought after that these shops were set up in London, as you can see them draped all around the windows. And as you probably know, the designs became adapted to sort of European taste, far away from their beautiful Kashmiri origins, and particularly in France, all the kind of bouteux designs became very elongated and kind of distorted. And if you talk to the French people, you think they invented the Cashmere Shawl because they had a very sophisticated French shawl industry. So I put these up here because there's very much this bouteux motif that becomes very much part of our design vocabulary. And of course it's called paisley, because what happened was that the Indian shawls, or Kashmiri shawls, were copied first in Norwich and then particularly in Scotland, where there were thousands, of something like 10,000 weavers in this tiny town in the area of Paisley, handloom weaving, and later machine loom weaving. So they became coarser and coarser, but they practically clothed the entire British nation in paisley shawls, which were very suitable for these huge dresses with crinoline structures, where you couldn't really wear a coat over them. So here we have Kashmir shawl in the V&A as it might have been worn over the muslin dress. Here you have Empress Josephine turning her Kashmir shawl into a gown. And here you have a sort of average person being photographed with a shawl, probably not an Indian one. There are many, many images of people wearing Indian shawls, and of course they eventually went out of fashion because fashions changed and the shawls weren't so suitable, and also once you've got the servants wearing them, you don't want to wear the same thing as them, even if it's an inferior version. And shawls did get turned into interesting garments. This is actually rather a beautiful jacket that really uses the pattern of the shawl very beautifully. I think it was made in Kashmir, and it works front and back symmetrically, which is quite something. And then men's garments too used the shawl idea. This waistcoat, which is 18th century, and later mid-19th century, this extraordinary sort of double-decker cloak, man's cloak, made out of shawls. And of course there were Indian chugga and things made out of shawls as well. And then I put this in as a sort of up-to-date version of this Kashmir shawl idea being made into a coat, and it's sold in a shop in London who deals in, trades in Indian textiles and clothing. So we still got it with us, this conversion of shawl into garments. Just put this one in on the left. It's a pattern book from a manufacturer from the late 19th century. Just to give an example, this is one of hundreds of thousands of examples you could find of these Indian motifs being used in often printed textiles, sometimes woven printed textiles in Britain. And a more modern version, Liberties, which is been famous since the mid-19th century for importing Indian goods and also converting the designs into something made here. So famous for their textiles, again, continuing to use these Indian motifs. So another way that the textiles came into our world in Britain was through the international exhibitions, and sometimes Indian palaces were constructed to display all the goods from India. And this particular one in 1886, Indian wood carvers and craftsmen were brought over to build this palace, and bits of it still survive in England actually. And the whole thing was hung with, when I read the newspaper reports, hung with fulkari. So you'd have gone in there and there would have been this wonderful shimmering silken glow around the exhibition. So it must have been quite stunning. There was also there was a great movement to reform and improve British design in the mid-19th century, and that's partly why the South Kent, what is now the Victoria and Albert Museum, was set up. So they wanted to have models of good design to improve the quality of what was churning out of the new British industrialised factories, a lot of which was very ugly. And a man called Owen Jones, who was a designer himself, helped to choose a number of Indian textiles from this huge exhibition, 1851, the Great Exhibition, to incorporate them into the collection, and they would be circulated around the country. He also made this wonderful book, with very, very high quality print, in which was the first example of showing designs from world cultures, not just British and European ones. And there's a whole page on, several pages on Indian designs, and they were particularly admired for their kind of regularity, not being over the top, coordinated colours. So this is a bit of Gujarati embroidery, actually. And here there's some woven silk, brocaded silks, and you probably recognise other things. So these were held up to be models of design for the new generation and for manufacturers to follow and be inspired by. Another manufacturer who came to India was Thomas Wardle. He was interested in keeping natural dyes going and not going into synthetic ones. And he also came and did a lot of work in India, research on dyes and helping improve the quality of silkworms and so on. And he also wasn't above borrowing Indian designs for under his own name. So, but nice restrained design, which was what the design reformers were after. And the great William Morris, supporter of the handcraft against machine production, went up to see Mr. Wardle in Staffordshire, who taught him how to dye with natural dyes. And there's a wonderful picture of him with his arms in the dye vat, and all covered in blue, indigo. And he also was inspired by Indian designs, probably maybe by Wardle, to do sort of Indian type designs, inspired designs. And even now, they're producing them under his name. So this old design of so-called Indian wallpaper is still being made, maybe in different colourways. So it's still with us, this English version of Indian design. Again, there was at the same movement as a time as design reform, there was a big movement for dress reform. There were people who thought women shouldn't be constricted by these terrible whalebone corsets that would sort of pinch them in to give them tiny waists, and they sort of did away with that. And this lady was actually born in India. She was one of 3 Anglo-Indian sisters who were very much a sort of part of the cultured bohemian life of London. And here she is painted by in a very loose-fitting, possibly muslin, I don't know, gown. Another society leader, Lady Duff Gordon. This dress was actually made from a piece of Indian brocade that someone bought from India. And this is Liberty's using Indian silk to make an unstructured dress. It's only got, you see the inside, it's only got a tiny bit of boning. No course, he didn't believe in corsets either. Thanks. So another important way in which British Indian textiles were used was to be seen in these set of books called the Textile Manufacturers of India. And this man, Mr. Forbes Watson, who was a temporary director of the former East India Company Museum, and eventually mainly became the V&A, decided that what he needed to do was cut up the fabrics in the collection with scissors and put them into these sort of pattern books or sample books, so that he could send these books around the manufacturing areas of Britain so that people could copy them. Because he thought, why are we sending all this money out to India to buy textiles when we could clothe the millions of Indians? So it was a kind of blatant effort to really replace the Indian textile industry. Nonetheless, there's 2 sets of two series. The one on the right is designed like this, and one like this, and so you can give a very, very close-up view of the textiles. He says where they came from, how much they cost, what they measured, and often how they were worn. So these were really guidelines for manufacturers in Britain. And a little bit so you could examine the texture. You weren't supposed to touch that bit, you could touch the bottom bit. So these are two examples, not actually from those books, that I found of British manufacturers absolutely completely copying Indian designs in the National Archives, where manufacturers had to register their designs so that other people wouldn't copy them. And I found a lot of examples of people, manufacturers exactly copying things in the books I've just shown you, or other Indian textiles maybe that they could see in the museum. So here's a Gujarati embroidery done in a machine-printed version in rather crude colours in Manchester, which would be sent out to India. There's also a big Indian textile manufactory in Scotland called Turkey Red. So they did sort of so-called Indian designs, so-called tie-dye, all printed with this particular process of dyeing, and even made Indian-looking labels to make them look appealing to Indian customers. They also did this for Iran and Mexico and countries. They targeted markets around the world very successfully. So that's why you get Gandhi, obviously, saying, I hold it to be sinful for me to refuse to buy the cloth spun and woven by the needy million of Indians' paupers, and to buy foreign cloth, although it may be superior in quality to the Indian hand-spun. So, wasn't always superior, actually. I don't think you can say that machine-spun cloth is superior to Indian hand-spun. They could certainly never quite match the muslin, and they couldn't make Varanasi brocades, for example. They couldn't copy the embroidery. They could only do a cheap imitation. So there were plenty of shops selling Indian wares in London. There's an exhibition stand for Liberty, so you can see a different variety of things that they have, and also Indian merchants in London. In fact, I discovered that Liberty bought most of his things for his shop from other wholesale merchants who were importing from India and other Asian countries. So you could have a complete Indian interior, so-called Indian interior in your house, sort of like an exotic tent. And a shop like Liberty's could come along and sort it all out for you, make the furniture, provide the hangings, the carpets, everything, and even the clothes to wear in it if you wanted to. So this was an actual room in someone's house. Now, I have to mention British royalty and Indian dress and Indian fabrics. As you all know, it was announced that Queen Victoria would be Empress of India in 1877. She wasn't very popular at home at the time, so I think they thought making her Empress of India was sort of raising her profile a bit. And also after the catastrophe of the East India Company. So here she is, Victoria, Queen of Great Britain, Empress of India, on her Golden Jubilee. And here she is sitting on the ivory throne presented to her by the Maharaja Travancore, the time of the Great Exhibition in 1851. So, you know, there was a lot of homage paid by some of the Indian princes to royalty, and a huge collection of gifts, some of which have just been on display, that were presented to usually rather large, decorated, glittery, useless objects as, you know, presentation gifts, particularly when the Prince of Wales went to India. But what's interesting is the way that Indian textiles entered into the royal household. And here's an example which I believe is on show at Buckingham Palace at the moment, or has been. And it's a fancy, the Victorian people love fancy dress parties, you know, before television, and so they like to entertain themselves. Many fancy dress parties with very elaborate costumes. And this one is a sort of 17th century dress, but made out of Varanasi brocade. That's actually obviously been sent from India, so you get this funny mixture of styles here. But okay, the Queen's wearing it, so it's acceptable. And here she is with her Indian servant, or known as the Munchi, with, I'm not sure whether, I can't swear that these are Indian, I can't swear that where they've come from, but you see many examples. I looked at the photograph collection in Windsor Castle, and they had a lot of things that looked like Indian fabrics. So we won't go into that story, but she became very enamoured of all things Indian. He taught her bits of Urdu and Hindi and so on, and became very unpopular. Everybody thought he was a spy and so on. But she became very engaged with the whole idea of India, partly because she became empress, I suppose. But and it was so here, two of her sons, photographed wearing Sikh dress, which I imagine must have been sent as a gift from some Indian princes or something. And they did a lot of these tableaux where they dressed up and were photographed in kind of poses. And here I even saw in a magazine of the time Indian printed cottons hanging on the walls of a royal dining room. I'm not sure which palace it was in. So some probably similar to this printed cotton. So that's quite interesting. Now I want to talk about, for a minute, about Mary Curzon. As you probably know, is the wife of Lord Curzon, who was then Viceroy of India at the time of the great Delhi Durbar to celebrate the coronation of Victoria's son, Edward VII. And Mary Curzon was wealthy in her own right and daughter of a rich department store owner in Chicago in America, and she had all her clothes made in by Worth in Paris, who was the go-to couturier of the day. But she had a lot of the fabrics made in India, and for this great Delhi Durbar occasion, which was like an alternative coronation event, huge event in Delhi, the new capital, she had this extraordinary dress made, and I couldn't, I'm afraid, find a picture of the detail. It's known as the Peacock Dress, because the whole design is like peacock feathers, and it's all done with zari work and beetle wing. So the feather shape starts small at the back, and they're tapered, or they get larger as they get to the bottom, so it's rather like a peacock's tail fanning out. So it is actually the most extraordinary dress, and you can still see it in the family home in Derbyshire. It's on display. She also had, so that was made, the fabric was made in Delhi. She also, I'll tell you where in a minute, she also had a number of other garments made in Delhi, which I saw in the Fashion Museum in Bath. They're all Indian work, and really rather like saris, very elaborate saris actually. So here you can see some of the detail. I'll hop on, because the next thing we find is that when King Edward VII was eventually crowned in 1902, Queen Alexandra, his wife, was more or less wearing an Indian sari. Now this is really quite extraordinary. So it was almost a religious occasion. There was a great golden canopy. I've no idea whether the golden fabric came from India. I've always wanted to know, but I don't know. And very big ritual and ceremony and so on. And under her ermine and velvet robes, she's wearing this interesting gown. And this was designed in secret because she didn't want all the court ladies to know what she was going to wear, because if they did, they'd all copy her, she said. So this was a deathly secret. She asked Mary Curzon to get some fabric made for her in India, so there's a very symbolic act about this link with India. And she also knew that Mary Curzon had good taste and all that. And this was designed so that they just installed electricity in Westminster Abbey. So at the moment of the coronation, the electric lights came on, and everybody would have sparkled and shimmered. So this is the gown that she wore. And as you can see, I mean, I think this, like some of the Curzon garments, are very Indian looking. Actually, the structure of the dress is historical, but the way it drapes, I think, owes a lot to the nature of the fabric. Here, it's a very light net or gauze embroidered with lots of gold spangles and so on. And it was made in this workshop here in Delhi, belonging to a man called Kishan Chand. So this was from a newspaper, so it was eventually published. So in a way it was kind of good PR that we're having her coronation gown made in India. So here they are all working at the embroidery frame. This is details of the dress, which is very fragile and comes in such an enormous box it takes 4 people to lift it, and they can't get it out because it might fall to pieces, but we were allowed a peek once, and this is the peek we had. So this is the style, a historical style that's got nothing to do with India really, but showed all this, so she would wear her jewels and pearls and all the rest of it. And here's a detail of the actual embroidery. So I was really surprised to find the Queen getting crowned in Indian clothes, sort of Indian clothes. After this, there are numerous other examples of Indian styles and textiles being used. Here's just one or two. A jacket made by a very fashionable sort of bohemian lady of her day, of the 1920s and 30s, and she had this little jacket I also saw in that same museum, which had obviously been made from a sari, so whether it was made by her or a dressmaker or made in India, I really don't, nobody knows. But she liked to wear kind of folk costumes, so this is one of the things there were a couple of them. Here's another garment made of brocaded gold fabric made in India in the 1920s, and there would have been many examples like that. Another very fashionable designer of the 1960s who wore made very oriental looking clothes, and this too is made of Indian fabrics. So here we get to the Beatles, who famously came to India to follow their guru in 1968, maybe as a way of trying to cope with their fame, I don't know. But they all dressed up in Indian gear, and interestingly, the picture you saw at the beginning, they were wearing jackets made of Indian fabric, and when I was in Kolkata last week, I met an old friend who some of you may know called Ruby Pal Chowdhury.
Yes.
And she said that when she was in London at this time, she used to be printing fabrics, and she actually printed some fabrics that were made into jackets with the Beatles. So I sent her the other picture and I said, do you think these were they? And I haven't heard back from her yet, but it'd be an amazing coincidence. If not, I'm going to find a picture of one of the ones she did. So again, at this point, you get young people doing the hippie trail to India, bringing things back, lots of shops selling inexpensive Indian garments, and at that time Carnaby Street, which is now a sort of nothing place that sells trains and so on, you could go down and sniff the fabric dye from the coarse muslin that was cheesecloth. A lot of the clothes were made from a very coarse muslin called cheesecloth, and lots of these Afghan jackets and so places like the Portobello Road, King's Road, Chelsea, which have all become very commodified, and then Carnaby Street, you could buy all these kind of things. So here we are, the alternative style icons of the day, dressing in Jimi Hendrix, he lived in London for a while, so he's a bit English, Afghan coat, and with his, usually made of rather smelly sheepskin. Mick Jagger, again, wearing an Indian fabric with a sort of Nehru-type collar. And these clothes people loved them because they were not what their parents were wearing. It was a complete liberation from what you were expected to wear as a young woman or a young man, and so you were kind of breaking all the clothing rules. So, same time as the miniskirt. So you could choose, you either wanted to be modern and mini, or you could go hippie and alternative and Asian. And so there was a huge influx of Indian influences at that time. At every level, expensive down to very, very cheap. There were lots of very high-quality shops selling Indian things at the time in London. And it found its way even into the pages of Vogue. The most famous fashion photographer of the day, David Bailey, doing a fashion shoot in Kashmir, which is sort of Indian. The clothes, she's wearing a turban and she's sitting on Indian cushions. So it was, a bit Indian and a bit modelling clothes that you could buy in London, just normal clothes. But of course, Indian Vogue goes completely the other way when it comes out, and is much more westernised. So, there's a big time difference, obviously, between the two. So more recent Indian influences are fashion model Kate Moss, who's a huge influence on style, and everybody wanted to be like her, designed a range of garments for a popular shop called Topshop, which aims at a youth market, inexpensive, week-to-week fashion clothes, fast fashion really. So she designed a collection, and it was very Indian in influence, extraordinarily, in 2014 and 2009. So here's one which has still got its butta, though she's not wearing it in a particularly Indian way. Here she is out on the town wearing a kind of coat made of a Cashmere Shawl type of or paisley fabric. So she's still working, and she's always hot on the trend, advanced the trend. And here's a little dress she designed for Topshop that we directly linked to a fabric from Lahore in the V&A collections. I mean, they must have been to see this piece of fabric at some point, the fabric designers. And here again is what she called hippie dress, another hippie dress, close fitting with the butta motifs again. So not Indian in design, but Indian in kind of feel. Even if people didn't realise it, which they probably didn't. More recently, some examples of copying mirror work, the sort of mirror work you find in Kutch and maybe Rajasthan. So Burberry's do this boy wearing a coat with mirror work, 2015. ASOS is a very inexpensive online garment provider. So mirror work you wear with your sort of mini shorts, mirror work jackets. And here is Beyoncé. I know she's not English, she's American, but what an outfit to wear for. And she was invited to come and sing at an Indian wedding, and this was the outfit she chose to make herself look more Indian, I guess. But still using the mirror work motif. I should say, of course, that there's a huge population of Indian origin in England, and there's a whole separate supply chain from which they buy their saris, their wedding lengas, everything that they can buy. So that's not filtered through Western shops, it's filtered through shops from different parts of India and Bangladesh as well. And some of them are really quite grand shops. And there's whole sections of London, in East London and West London, where there are lots and lots of these shops. So finally, I think there's a sort of move against fast fashion, particularly after things like the Rana Plaza collapse and general climate and ecology concerns, and certainly younger designers and a lot of consumers are beginning to feel that this whole fast fashion based on very badly paid, badly looked after textile and garment workers is not right, and that you shouldn't be able to buy a party dress for £5 or 50 rupees really to wear once. What is the maker getting paid for that? So it's beginning to come in, and so there are a number of people really looking at more sustainable fashions, but a new generation of designers being trained, I think, of being encouraged to think about this more. Certainly fashion students I talked to in Kolkata last week were really keen on handloom, supporting handloom, handcraft, khadi, recycling and all the rest of it. So this is just one brand, I'm not promoting them particularly. It's called Toast, and I just noticed in their recent catalogue, Kanta is very popular in England, and I think it's because partly it's beautiful, and partly it tunes into this idea of recycling and reworking and not just being wasteful. And I think that's part of the appeal. So this company makes middle to high end. It's not designer level, but they're not cheap. This coat costs £235 in the UK. They both cost about the same. They're reversible. But this company is very concerned to make ethical clothing. So it's made by a fair trade cooperative somewhere in India and sustainable everything. So this may be the price you have to pay for that. You can't have giveaway prices. I mean, I think this particular company is an ethical company. It doesn't just say it is, and it's very keen to support different types of textile workers and bring in work and bring in designs from around the world and use natural fabrics, natural fibres. So it seems to be possibly a tiny ray of hope that that's where we're going, possibly, but still India leading the way. So that's it. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer, or want to make any comments, or say I've got something wrong, or more to the point, I could learn something.
Does Downton Abbey have any Indian fabrics?
Well, does Downton Abbey have any Indian fabric? To be honest, I'm not a big watcher of Downton Abbey, so I don't know. I don't know. I'm afraid I couldn't tell you. Though I have to say that a lot of television series, they do pay a lot of attention to the clothing. The clothing wardrobe designer is an important person, so they have Indian fabrics. They're probably proper ones, yeah, but I don't know. Sorry, it probably wasn't quite the right period. I don't know. Right. Anybody else?
So when they were dumping in
one second. The mic.
Lady back there as well.
So when they were dumping the textiles made in England, in India, they were mostly of Indian designs.
What, this one?
Yeah.
This one?
No, the ones that one of the screens, you showed.
Oh, yes.
You said that they were cheap imitation of Indian things.
This one?
No, much of it.
Red turkey. Red turkey.
Yes, sorry.
No, were the designs mostly of Indian patterns to attract Indians, or would it be mixed kind of designs?
Sorry.
So the material that came back from Britain to India,
Yes.
did it have British motifs or Indian motifs?
Well, they made what they thought were Indian motifs, but they sent some terrible things back here, and they tried. As you see, they tried to copy what they thought were Indian design. I mean, sometimes they did copy them exactly. For example, but very often they did woven and embroidered things, but printed, so they look strangely wrong. Apart from the fact they're not always very well printed. So,
Thank you.
There's a lady over there.
I can just show. I wondered, given the...
sorry, we're recording.
Oh, so yeah. I wondered, given the amount of influences that you've shown within British textiles,
Yes.
whether you feel that somewhere like the V&A Museum, which was, many of the garments that you showed and the textiles that you showed were from the V&A Museum, whether they could do a better job or approach their collections differently to kind of show this influence, because they have this sort of separate South Asian collection and they have their British collections, but
the manufacturers.
somewhere like the V&A Museum,
Yes.
and the way that the narrative that you've told,
Yes.
whether that could be better brought into a space like the V&A Museum to tease out how much connection there is between the two, and I guess how much we think of as British textiles is actually hugely influenced by Indian textiles.
Well, I think it actually applies to all the decorative arts, because a few years ago they opened what are called the British Galleries in the museum. So this was historical span. I don't know why they call them British Galleries, because if you go through them, there are so many foreign influences there, whether it's Spanish metalworkers, French weavers, Indian textile designers, or Japanese. There's a whole room on Japanese influences. So sometimes so they are British, but it's not pure. It's difficult to disentangle. There's no really such thing as a pure. There's always been these global interconnections. And I think those galleries show it very clearly if you've ever been there. And they do show in the textiles. And even Owen Jones, who did that printed book I showed you, said, well, these should have been for inspiration. You should never copy them. But I found examples of how he exactly copied them in his own textiles. Because they're very appealing, have I really answered your question? I'm not sure if I have.
I think so. I was interested to know as somebody that's kind of invested time in looking at these connections, whether you think somewhere like V&A is doing a good enough job to also demonstrate these connections. I think people are very aware of all these things. They have a limited amount of, although it's a huge place, they have a limited amount of space in which to show, even within the Nehru Gallery, which is the Indian section, they have so much to try and squeeze into that, that they can only show a limited selection of textiles. And when I was working on a research project there, we did put a lot on the internet about this relationship between Britain and India in textiles. I'm not sure if it's still there because they tend to change them. So I think people are aware of it. There isn't always a forum for actually showing it. But there was some of it in the Fabric of India exhibition, but it was mainly to highlight India's superb skills, not to show how we ruined them, if you like. But yes, I think there's always an opportunity for that.
I had two questions actually. You brought up you mentioned calico when you talked of muslin.
Yes.
You briefly mentioned calico. Have you studied the calico trade or the way it was popularized in Britain, whether it became a kind of generic name for Indian textiles?
Well, not in detail, but there was, because one of the things that's difficult is to understand when they say calico, actually what they mean. Calico is a big umbrella term in terms of the import trade. So you're never quite sure, you don't have the sample there, quite sure what it means. Muslin, if you look up muslin in America, they mean quite a coarse, thick fabric. And I could show you examples of British muslin, which is quite thick, nothing like Bengal muslin. So I think one problem is, people have written many histories of books about cotton, particularly cotton imports into Britain. But when you really want the detail of which exact fabrics they're talking about, sometimes it isn't there. They'll give you a list, but it's really hard to put your finger on exactly what it was that was being shipped and consumed and for what. So there's lots of research opportunities for people to find out.
I was wondering if the word calico has anything to do with the town Calicut in Kerala. And because in the old days, especially post-independence, shortly after independence, there was a factory in Calicut called the Comtrust factory, which made a lot of this, exactly what you're saying, this coarse kind of fabric, which was very popular for bed linen and furnishings, for curtains and things. I remember when I was growing up, there was a lot of furnishing from Comtrust in Calicut, which you don't see anymore.
Yes.
So I just thought I'd mention that. The other question I had was about kalamkari, because on visits to Iran and Uzbekistan, I've seen so much of, what they call kalamkari, and obviously probably there's a link in the sense that it could have come into India with the Muslim rulers and the dynasties that came from Central Asia and also the Persian influence, because obviously there is a link there, and I don't know if you have specimens of that in the museum.
I think, well, that's several questions. Calico, I don't know what the actual origin of that is, but they do have in the museum lots of different types of things called calico, and sometimes it's sailcloth or towels, or, so all sorts of things, of these samples of cloth. And as for the influence from Iran and the Muslim influence, I think it comes into many areas of Indian textiles, but I haven't. Probably people here know more about that than I do, and it's something I'd love to follow up. How those skills migrated through from the Middle East down into India. But that's a really interesting topic. And also, there's the question of Armenians, traders, moving things around, both textiles and skills around, partly transmitting these skills around. So I think there's lots of complex stories to unravel.
Obviously the same generation, because I remember contrast and stuff, and I didn't know they'd gone out of business. Basically, contrast is short for Commonwealth Trust.
Sorry, could you put...
Contrast is short for Commonwealth Trust.
Yes.
That is the company.
Yes.
The other thing is that gown that you said in Alexandria War.
Yes.
I wondered why it was made in Delhi, because the capital hadn't been shifted to Delhi until a decade later. That is where Mary Curzon found. But she lived in Calcutta.
She was based in Calcutta, yes, but she found workers in Delhi who yes. And
interesting also that she was the daughter of the Chicago department store owner.
Yes, she had a feel for fabric.
That's just a comment.
No, the other thing that was interesting about that, because I read her letters to Princess Alexandra, as she was then, and it turned out, they're in the British Library, it turned out she had a number of things made for Princess Alexandra, and she sat on the floor of her room and copied them so that she could have copies made for herself and her mother and her sisters, so they could wear the same as the Queen of England.
I just have a question about the fabric. The fabric that came back from England, which was sold in India, obviously, because quite a bit of mill-made cloth came from England and we sold in India a little later, right?
Yes.
So handloom industry started to get affected by the cheap cloth that was being brought by England. So where would one find archives of the patterns that were on those fabrics, or what was being sold from England in India? Because they were cheaper than handloom cloth and destroyed quite a bit of handloom industry here. So would there be references of those patterns and fabrics that were sold in India?
How did they make the design on the patterns?
Also, archives of those patterns which were sold here.
Where did you find examples of that? Are there archives with examples of which
Yes, if you go to Scotland, they have a lot of those red ones. Turkey, there's a very, very good website on National Museums of Scotland that will show a huge range of those designs. I also looked at the archives of a Scottish muslin manufacturer, and they exported a lot to India, the late 19th century, early 20th century, but I think it got coarser and coarser, so eventually they were making kind of net curtains. But they would have people writing to them, telling them what they wanted. So these little samples would be sent back from India to England to modify the design. Say, well, we want more like, exactly like the chintz. We want more like, exactly like the muslin, especially the embroidered and jamdani muslins. So there would be a kind of intelligence passed back and forth. Though obviously it took a long time by sea to show what would sell in the markets. And so it was, but it took a long time to make those changes because of the time difference and so on. So yes, there were patterns. You can see pattern books if you can be bothered to go and look at them. And I've been in all sorts of dingy archives and looked at pattern books, and it's really interesting to look at them. Yeah. I think people need to go probably. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.